Hi there, my name is Bethany Williams and I'm a PhD candidate in English at UC Davis. Thanks for watching my presentation, Embodied Ecocriticism, Action and Agriculture as Environmental Texts. This project is an example and experiment in mind-body attention that I entrain as part of an embodied ecocriticism. I invite you to join in. My narration will proceed slowly and pause at times. Throughout the video, and especially in moments of relative stillness, I invite you to notice your physical or embodied state. What sensations and impulses do you encounter? Are you holding your breath? What do you feel in your shoulders and neck? Is there a way for you to be more comfortable, relaxed, and supported? What does that require? Perhaps you hear something that you question, something that you find curious, or something that makes you uncomfortable. What do you notice in your body in these moments? What unfolds as you watch and listen? What is your body telling you? I encourage you to think of your body as my co-narrator, providing an up-to-the-minute account of how you receive or feel about all of this information. As much as you can, notice what comes up without judgment. Our bodies receive, contain, share, and create knowledge. I suggest that our work in the environmental humanities must accommodate and prioritize this knowledge. I am writing in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many more. I am writing in a period of civil unrest as people around the world protest state-sanctioned, systemic, and vigilante violence against Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I'm grappling with how my work as an eco-critic might matter at all in these times, and I keep coming home to the body. In his book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, Resmaa Menakem writes that social and political action are essential, but they need to be part of a larger strategy of healing, justice, and creating room for growth in traumatized flesh and blood bodies. A healer, therapist, and trauma specialist, Menakem explains how white body supremacy is embedded in the bodies of all Americans on the cellular level, in our DNA and blood and nervous systems. He warns that we will never outgrow white body supremacy just through discussion, training, or anything else that's mostly cognitive. Instead, we need to look to the body and to the embodied experience of trauma. Is it time to panic yet? What can I do? The questions posed by this conference contain a much greater sense of urgency when read alongside the refrains of protest. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. The exigence of our crises are increased as we collectively rise up. Their due dates expedited as we begin to articulate the intersectionality of our demands. What does this have to do with eco-criticism? Environmental justice work underscores the right of all people and communities to equal environmental protections and reveals the disproportionate exposure of people of color to environmental hazards and health burdens. The same injustice that results in police brutality also doles out toxic neighborhoods, food deserts, exposure to agricultural chemicals, unsafe drinking water, and slower, subtler violences, alongside the more spectacular ones. ecological crisis, as health crisis, as social crisis, demands action. As critics, to continue researching, writing about, and teaching these issues without also taking action is unthinkable. There is no longer room for theory unattached to practice. We must abandon modes of inquiry that suggest a critical distance from the world and embrace those that demand immersion. So what can we do? We start by actually doing, and by refusing to ignore the part our bodies play in that. And so, I'm getting my hands dirty. With my interest in agricultural fiction and nonfiction, engaging with text on a purely theoretical or cognitive level never felt complete. If I were content to remain solely in the realm of the symbolic, it would have been fine. But the knowledge of my body is not something I am comfortable excluding. I'm not implying that every eco-critic needs to also be a farmer. However, I do think we need to be transdisciplinarily educated and engaged in physical practices that bring us into direct contact with the worlds we critique. Won't our comprehension improve if we can feel what our texts describe? And for me, small-scale farming's direct connection to sustainability, community building, climate concerns, food sovereignty, and anti-capitalist production make the farm an ideal location for field work. Last year, I worked on a friend's flower farm. I weeded and planted and harvested flowers, but I also tended to drip lines, ripped out old irrigation, and minded a finicky water pump. I fed sheep and goats and let the chickens out. I helped my friends rig up water systems and tied up drying lines. I began to experience what I had suspected all along. That small-scale farming has a lot to teach the eco-critic about understanding and facilitating multi-species becoming with, material semiotic interaction, and emergence. Adrienne Marie Brown describes emergence as the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. It emphasizes critical connections, authentic relationships, listening with the body and the mind. She bases her own emergent strategy on examples that she sees in nature or biomimicry. This is also how discourse functions. As powerful and world-making as it is a complex system built by the simplest of utterances. Suddenly, close reading and investigating the contents of a compost bin feel oddly intertwined. There is much to be cultivated here. Now, I am beginning to work an acre of my own. But of course, it's not mine at all. The land that I am setting out to feel with and learn from is in the Wapato Valley, ancestral land of the Tualatin peoples. Later, it was purchased by my partner's father with funds from the GI Bill, which he earned by entering the military at age 17 to fight in the Vietnam War. There is a multifaceted, multi-generational trauma involved in my presence here, my access to this space. In striving to work with the land, I inhabit these realities and try to honor them through co-creation. At this point, my operation is more of a robust garden, surrounded by woods and blackberries and poison oak, than any kind of farm. And yet, the cacophony of actors and inputs I'm getting to know and with whom I co-create provide a fully immersive experience. My body is the contact zone between those theories and practices I engage professionally. I feel I'm finally joining the ranks of those feminist scholars of science whom Karen Barad describes as working the equipment, theoretical and experimental, without any illusion of clean hands, and who unapologetically express their enthusiasm and amazement for the world and the possibilities of cultivating just relationships among the world's diverse ways of being and becoming. In spite of the notable lack of body work and literary eco-criticism, practitioners are surrounded by examples of how we might begin bringing our field to the field. In fact, embodied, experience-driven, praxis-oriented critique is firmly rooted in literary studies. Those working in critical race, feminist, and disability studies, among others, know well that the personal has never been apolitical, and that theory is impossible to disentangle from practice. That is simply how we live our lives. We already know how to think about how theory influences practice and, more specifically, how our experiences, conversations, and practices influence theory. These ideas, their potential and their pitfalls, are nothing new. While American pragmatism might not feel particularly close to modern socio-agro-ecological concerns, early pragmatist discussions surrounding the value of experimental and open-ended research, art as a conduit for empathy, and education for human flourishing foreshadowed recent developments in fields ranging from cognitive science to performance studies to STS. I am most interested in pragmatist speculations on embodiment and the possibility they see in communicating or sharing internalized experiences across bodies. However, I also struggle deeply with this notion. It challenges me and makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel a resonance when I read Robin Wall Kimmerer's explanation of learning from bees. It was the bees that showed me how to move between flowers, to drink nectar and gather pollen from both. It is this dance of cross-pollination that can produce a new species of knowledge, a new way of being in the world. And yet, to suggest that I might remotely understand racialized trauma or knowledge as they are experienced by people of color seems ignorant and deeply offensive. And so I return to Menakem's work. He lays out different iterations of racialized trauma so we might begin to understand, might begin healing by way of a radical, body-centered empathy. I will never share or experience what you felt, but I can empathize to the point of allyship and kinship. I can empathize to the point that it is impossible for me to sit idly by while people of color are murdered in the street. There is much to be cultivated here. And it will take work, real labor, blood, sweat, and tears, getting into the streets and putting our bodies on the line, getting into the field and putting our bodies on the line, hearing other people, hearing plants, hearing what our bodies have to say as we go. In performance studies, the theory and methods of such practice-led or practice-based research involve careful consideration of questions and problems that allow the methods to focus on ongoing and creative practices. This knowledge is embedded in practice, and the practice is a embodied one. As eco-critics, academics, and community members, we can adapt this perspective. We can undertake transdisciplinary work that is speculative and uncertain, an intervention in its own right, as it reflects on and fundamentally alters the fields of inquiry from which it grows. We can make this change, but we have to do the work. Work and labor are contested terms in environmental discourse. In considering why the neo-agrarian, as opposed to the blatantly racist Southern or aristocratic agrarians, philosophy is not well represented within larger environmental debates, William Major's The Agrarian Vision and Ecocriticism identifies labor as a central sticking point. Work is where humans have had the most contact with nature. It's also where we've caused the most damage. Human work with nature, agricultural and otherwise, is also a site of unfair, unethical, violent, and racist structures of power. There is also a cultural distaste for hard labor. It is something to outgrow and overcome. For many, success means not having to use your body to make money, even though my generation is demonstrably less content and consequently less optimistic than those that went before. Individually, we are less constrained by class and convention than our parents or grandparents, but more constrained by law, surveillance, state prescription, and personal debt. Was it worth it? And all the while, whether or not we defer or displace the personal contact, we are always dependent on bodies working the soil. Wendell Berry writes that no matter how urban our life, our bodies live by farming. We come from the earth and return to it, and so we live in agriculture as we live in flesh. Would it be so bad if the bodies we lived by were our own? Agrarianism's faith in the possibility of sustainable land use and caring, equitable working relationships between human and non-human reveals our aversion to work as one consequence of modernity's fatal obsession with the myth of progress. It is a myth of progress founded on a myth of nature. The kind of work that I propose and participate in does not advance ongoing narratives of progress as they have been traditionally considered. It is uncivilized. It does not intend to produce scalable strategies. It is provisional. It has no truck with seductions to organic wholeness. It is partial. The agricultural and critical and social work I entrain are necessarily local, personal, and specific. And yet, of course, they are responding to global political crises. Mike Madison, a veteran farmer in Davis, California, writes that all agriculture is local, and the particular details of my operation might not be applicable elsewhere, but the basic variables are universal, and every farmer has to solve the same set of problems in whatever way works. We are united in our problems, but must determine intimately personal paths, beginning with the body, in our attempt to find solutions. This applies in a social justice context as well as an eco-critical one. We might approach our texts, our conversations, and our interactions in the way a small-scale farmer approaches their plot of land, with a strong foundation of knowledge, a strong set of skills, and the understanding that each engagement contains unique requirements that must be carefully and slowly perceived through generous, empathic, and committed work.